to a new instructional video from Sekatsu Bonsai School. Today I'm going to be looking at repotting, and in particular repotting of indoor trees. I am going to do another video on outdoor tree repotting, but it's a much more complex subject because different varieties of trees need different treatment and need repotting at specific times of year, so there's more to talk about in that, so I'll do a completely separate video. This one is concentrating purely on indoor trees. The subject for this one is a little 15cm Chinese elm because it's a very common tree and one that a lot of people will have. So first of all, I'm going to look at why we repot bonsai trees. In the main, the reason is that for the health of the tree. So after a certain amount of time in a pot, bonsai by their very nature are pot bound. That's what helps to keep them small and miniature. So they get a lot of root and not an awful lot of soil. So what we need to do is replenish the soil and make some more space in the pot for new roots to grow in, so we get lots of new feeder roots. This helps to keep your tree healthy. You can also repot for aesthetic reasons. So for example, today I'm going to repot this tree into this pot, which is for our new gift range of bonsai. So this is purely an aesthetic change. This particular tree probably would be okay in the pot for another year. That said, trees when they're imported from China and the Far East generally come in not very good soil. I think they tend to use whatever's readily available. So again, changing the soil is a good idea. What equipment do we need to repot a bonsai tree? Okay, so this is a complete selection of tools and equipment that I would use for repotting. Some of it can be substituted, and I'll let you know which bits can. You can also use, whatever you have to hand. It's just to do the job properly, you need a set of tools like we've got here. So we'll run through. Obviously, we need the tree. We also need some bonsai substrate. This particular soil that I'm using today is our own mix that we sell, and is ideal for pretty much every indoor bonsai tree. You can buy that on the website in all sorts of sizes. That's just a 1 litre bag, which for a pot this size at 15cm will be plenty, but we sell in other sizes as well. We also need the pot. Again, these are available from us on the website. This is a green glazed oval pot. You can see it's a bit shallower than the one the tree's in at the moment, and I think it'll look quite nice in there. We need mesh. Now this is used, and you'll see later, this is used to keep the soil in the pot, because bonsai pots generally have very large drainage holes, and bonsai soil is relatively small grained, so you can spend your time pouring the soil in the pot, and it's all pouring out the bottom. Not a great idea, so this stops that from happening. Some bonsai wire. I'm using 1.5mm bonsai wire here for this particular size of tree. If you've got something bigger, you might need something a bit heavier, but generally speaking, 1.5mm is okay. And this is for tying the tree in the pot. Again, I'll come on to the whys of that later. A root hook. This is for removing the soil from around the tree, or the existing soil, and for teasing out the roots. You can use this, or on smaller trees I tend to use one of these, which is a hardened bamboo tool made specifically for bonsai repotting. I found these some while ago, and I've got one. This is a new one, but I've got one here that I've been using for repotting all sorts of trees for probably the last 10 years, and it's still going. So they're a good investment. I've also got some wire cutters, obviously for cutting the wire. Again, you can use pliers, wire snips, whatever you like, but these are the proper thing. So that's all the equipment we need. So I'll just clear the decks and we'll get on to actually repotting the tree. Okay, first things first, removing the tree from the pot. What you don't want to do is to damage the roots before you've had a chance to have a good look at them, and also to tear them away from the base of the trunk. So getting the tree out of the pot is a case of using something. An old plastic chopstick from the takeaway works reasonably well, especially the pointed ones. So that's a good tool to use if you haven't got one of these. So what we need to do is just loosen the soil around the sides of the pot. We're just trying to separate the soil as near as we can all the way around. So this takes a bit of patience, but it's worth it in the long run. And what you don't want to do is put pressure on the trunk and try and pull the tree out, because that will damage roots. We're just trying to tease it out gently. And then once we've loosened the soil all the way around the edge, we're just going to use the chopstick or whatever you're using as a bit of a lever just to raise the tree out of the pot. So as you can see, that's gently coming out. This gets as much as possible of the root out and without causing any damage. So here we go. There we are. So now we're clear of the pot. So we now have the tree, and you can see a relatively condensed root ball, and we've got an awful lot of roots that have grown outside of the soil. So this, actually looking at it, is pretty much ready for repotting. So what we need to do now is remove as much of this old soil as we can, because this is probably depleted. It's not got any drainage in it at all. There's no aggregate or anything in here. It's just a solid lump. As you can see, if I shake it, nothing comes off. And this is likely what you'll find when you're repotting your tree, if it's one of this type of tree. So again, chopstick or whatever tool you're using, we just need to gently tease the roots out all the way around the edge. If you start from the edges and work inwards, that's usually the best way to do this. And we'll just get as much of this off as we can. This may take a while, so bear with me. But I thought I'd rather show you the whole process than do the whole slow motion thing, because sometimes it's better to see from beginning to end. So again, I'm just gently teasing out the roots. As you can see, as I'm doing it, the soil is coming out, but it's a slow process because it's all absolutely welded in there to the roots. So and you can also, I don't know if you can see that, but here there's a very heavy root. So what we want to try and do is get that out so we can see what's going on, because it may be, sometimes you find these support roots, I call them, and they probably have got a proper biological name, but you tend to find these big roots have gone round and round the pot, and when you get to the end of them, actually they've got barely any feeder roots on at all. So they're really just taking up room. But you can't find that out until you've actually teased it right out of the pot. Also, you tend to find in here, so this is the base of the root ball, almost directly underneath the trunk, you'll tend to get a dead spot where water hasn't got to, and there's been no air, and it basically, the soil's got very compressed. Now there, generally, you don't have very much live root. And that's the other thing we want to do. We want to get some decent bonsai soil into that area so you can get some nice feeder roots close into the trunk. And you can see it's starting to loosen up gradually, and we're starting to see some of these paler feeder roots. And what we want in the longer term, what we want next time we repot it, is a whole pot full of those. If you've got that, you've got you've got a very good chance of the bonsai being healthy and continuing to thrive. So again, just carrying on, working my way around the edges to try and open up the root ball. If the root ball's a little bit dry, then before you do this, it's a good idea to have a bit of a water. I find it, although it does make the soil damp and it makes the whole job a bit messy, This particular type of soil, it tends to get it off a bit easier. You know, I think if you've got it in decent bonsai soil, you haven't got so much of an issue. I've also found, having opened that up a bit, you can see there's actually quite a nice root here which was invisible. It was underneath the soil, which increases the size of the buttress on the tree, makes it look a bit more bonsai-like. Now, again, I'm just trying to loosen off this big root here because I'd be interested to see. There we go. So you can see you've got a massive thick root here, but what you've got on the end is a very small amount of feeder root. So when we get to cleaning up the root ball, it may well be that I'll take that one off. So, but we'll see what we've got in terms of root. So you can see once you get the depleted soil off, you know, you've got a relatively compact root ball there. So you can sometimes find that when you've done this, you can actually pot, if you want to, you can pot into a smaller bonsai pot that's more to your taste. And also, if in a smaller bonsai pot, the tree tends to look a bit more, well, it tends to look a bit larger and a bit more impressive. So sometimes it's worth looking at that possibility. Right, so I'm pretty much got all of the old soil off there. I've got everything out of this dead spot here. You can see that there's roots here, off to the sides, but there's not really anything here. And that's basically because it just, that particular part of the tree you can sat under the trunk just doesn't get, generally in bad soil, doesn't get enough water, doesn't get enough air, doesn't get enough of anything. So there we go. Okay. So next part of the video we'll move on to root pruning. I'll just clear the decks a bit. Okay, so here we have our root ball devoid of the majority of the soil. Generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, I would say only ever take off about 1/3 of the roots that are there. Generally speaking, that's enough to make enough space in the pot and enough space for new soil, and it means that you cause the least damage to the tree. So that's the main thing. So in the case of this one, as we said, this big long root here, I'm going to take this off right at the top here. So that's now completely gone. It's not quite 1/3 of the root ball, and probably because I'm putting it actually in a slightly larger pot in terms of spread anyway, because obviously now these roots are loose, I can spread them sideways, so we can take up the rest of it in the pot there. But if your roots are down here, literally just take off 1/3 at the bottom. Take off any really big support roots like that. As we said, very small amount of fine feeder root on that, and there's plenty left on the tree still. Anything that wraps itself round and round the tree, try and get rid of that as well. Okay. I realised that I forgot to mention that another part of the equipment is a pair of scissors, obviously for pruning the roots. I am just going to take off the tips of those ones just to encourage them to spread a bit. So there we are. And also the time of year for this. Although technically you can do this process on an indoor tree at any time of year, because they're kept indoors, they're growing all season. But I do find that they tend to sulk a lot less after repotting if you still stick to the Bonsai maxim of repotting in the early spring. The ambient temperatures are warmer, your house temperature is more stable. There's just a whole lot of reasons why it's better to do it at that time of year. So if you can, stick to that. If you really need to do it at another time of year, just be very careful with the watering afterwards. Don't waterlog the tree, and make sure you keep it well away from heat sources like radiators or fires or too much direct sunlight, anything that might dry out the roots and not allow them to grow and produce new ones. So that's that bit done. Next we'll get on to preparing the pot for your newly root pruned bonsai. So now we're going to get on to preparing the pot. So this is the particular pot I'm using, which has 2 drainage holes in, as you can see, and they're quite big. I can nearly fit my little finger through them, so not ideal, because the bonsai soil will literally just pour through the holes because it's very fine grained, so you'll lose all your soil. So what you need to use is some bonsai mesh. Now you can either do this, because there's 2 drainage holes, you can cut individual small squares and put one over each drainage hole, but sometimes that can slip over time, so where I can, I tend to cut one piece that will fit the whole of the bottom of the pot. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of edge pruning on this just to get it to fit. There we go. So now, as you can see, I've got one piece of mesh that covers both drainage holes. Okay. Now if you do it that way, then the mesh has less room to move, so it tends to stay in place, just with the soil and the tying in wire on top of it. But to be cautious, it's always a good idea to tie them in, and if you use 2 individual blocks, definitely do that, because potentially they can move around. Okay, so to tie that in place, we use some of our wire. About 6 inches of wire is probably about enough. Probably got more than that there, but you can always snip off the ends if you get too much. But if you don't get enough, it doesn't go all the way through the pot, and you don't get the purchase that you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little loop in one side of the wire, like so, and then in the opposite direction I'm going to loop the wire the other side, like so. So you get this shape. And then we just bend down these 2 legs that we've got, and these need to be about as far apart as the diameter of your hole. So I can see that's a bit big, so I'm just going to move that in a little bit. So there we go. So now we push them through the mesh. So on this side we've got our little butterfly almost. On the other side we've got the 2 legs sticking out. Yeah. So then we'll just push these legs, and I tend to just curl them back around like so. And now what you've got, the mesh stays in place in the pot, and it's held firmly in its position and won't move. So I'm just going to do the same for the other side. Again, loop this way, and then another loop in the opposite direction to get this, and bend the wires down like so. Adjust it to roughly the size of the base hole in your pot. I'm going to trim those ones off a bit because they're a bit over long, but better to do it that way than not. Again, pushing with your thumb on the inside of the pot to get it nice and tight, and then bend over so you've got a nice hook at the bottom. So now you've got your mesh in position, you've got 2 holders to make sure it doesn't move about. So that's all ready. So now the only other thing we need to worry about is a tying in wire. Now you'll probably find that when you took your bonsai out of the pot, it didn't have a tying in wire, and this is usually because they're lifted from the field, put into the bonsai pot, and the root ball is big enough that they don't need to worry about that. They just literally push it into the pot and it holds itself in position. But when you've repotted, you've obviously taken away quite a bit of the roots that were supporting the tree, so it can get a bit wobbly. So if your cat decides to knock it over, or you know, somebody brushes past it when it's sat on the side, potentially that could knock the tree over, and this may tear some of your new roots that you're growing. So always a good idea to tie it in. So I'm going to get a long length of wire. I think that's probably about 2 feet. I don't know, I'm not very good at this, but I have a tendency to get far too much wire. So anyway, I'd always rather have too much than not enough. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through one drainage hole, and obviously through one of the holes in the mesh, right the way underneath the pot, and back out the other side into the other drainage hole. So now we have these two long wires, which can now be looped over the top of the root ball and tightened up to hold the tree firmly in place. Okay, so that's the pot prepared and ready to receive the tree. Okay, if you have a pot with just a single drainage hole in, then the process is slightly different, because obviously you haven't got two holes to loop your wire through. So a little trick for this: tie it in as we talked about before, so making your loops. Into the pot and bent over. And now what I'm going to do for the tying in wire, I've got a piece of heavier bonsai wire here. This is 3.5mm, I think, but you could use a heavy-ish cocktail stick or a little piece of wood, as long as it's quite flat, because you don't want your pot to wobble afterwards we've done this, and this is going to sit underneath. So then we get your tying in wire, and we take a couple of turns round the thicker piece of wire to hold it in place, and then we feed both of these wires back up through the drainage hole on each side. So I don't know if you can see that, but we're feeding them back through the drainage hole, and then your thicker piece of wire will sit across the drainage hole at the bottom and hold these two tying in wires in place. You can spread them out then at the top, and you have a very similar setup to what we had in the 2-hole pot. So that's the way of doing a single one. If anybody's got any simpler ideas, then I'm happy to hear them, because that is always a bit of a pain, and it does also block up a little bit of the drainage hole. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. You know, if you can get 2-hole drainage pots, it's much better anyway. But on the smaller sizes like this, they've quite often only got one, and sometimes on the round pots as well have the same issue. But that's a way of doing it that will hold your tree in place securely. Obviously, after a period of time, when the tree feels solid in the pot and the roots have grown out a bit, you can remove the tying in wire, but it won't do any harm while it's in place. So next part, we'll put the tree in its new home. Okay, so now we have our prepared pot. We have our newly root pruned Chinese elm. I've got my bonsai repotting tool or chopstick or whatever else you like to use, and some bonsai soil. So now we're going to sit the tree in its new home. I also have a soil scoop here. Again, you can use a small plastic jug from the kitchen or whatever. These are obviously a bit more straightforward because they're designed for the job. So the first thing we're going to do is get some of our bonsai soil mix. And we're going to put a little mound roughly in the centre of the pot. So again, I'm not sure if you can see that properly. Yeah, so that's a nice little mountain shaped lump in the middle there. The idea being that obviously as you're putting the tree into the pot, you need some of that soil right underneath the root ball, and it's not always easy to get that in afterwards. So if you do a mound and then settle the tree gently into the mound, then obviously the soil gets into all the nooks and crannies. So I'm going to get my tree, I'm going to spread the roots out sideways. Obviously, because I've got a wider pot here, I can afford for them to go outwards rather than straight downwards. I'm going to sit that on top of my mound of soil and then just gently twist it until the tree is roughly at the height I want it to the pot. Also, this is a good time to look at whether it was in the pot at the right angle. You might want to tilt it left or right. You can obviously do that, and I'll cover those sort of things in more in styling videos, which will be coming over the course of this year. As it happens, this one was pretty much where I would expect it to be. So I'm just gonna, yep, so I'm happy with that. So now we hold the tree in its position. We've got our 2 tying in wires here. So I'm going to take them round. In this case I'm going to take them around the back of the tree. It's always preferable if you can do that, because you don't really want to see a big ugly wire. Having said that, once you've repotted the tree and put the new soil in, then generally the wire will end up under the soil surface by a bit. So now you can see I'm just twisting those together. Firstly by hand, just to get them roughly round the root ball. Okay, so now they're hand tied, and obviously I've got some extra wire there. I'm going to use my wire cutters just to snip that off closely. So now we've just got a little tab here of twisted wire. I'm using gin pliers for this, but you can use normal pliers, needle nose pliers or anything like that. So we're just getting hold of that little tab. I'm pulling it out towards me and twisting. So I'm not putting undue pressure on it, but just enough to keep it tight. So yeah, just a little bit more. Again, pull first to make a little bit of slack in the wire, and then twist it gently. Okay, and that's the test of if it's tied in properly. I've lifted the tree and the pots come with it. I'm not sure I'd recommend that at home if this is your first time doing it. I was reasonably sure that was going to work, so it's a bit like the chefs with the meringue and holding it over their heads. You know, it's I've done it enough times to know that that's okay. So, but that's the sort of how tight it needs to be. Not so much that you're actually digging into the bark or breaking roots, but just enough to hold the tree in place. So now we've got a little bit of sticking up wire here, which I'm just going to bend down into the soil, what will be the soil. So that's the tree potted. That's how it will look once I've got the soil in. So I'm quite happy with the position of it and how it looks aesthetically. So now we've just got to fill the soil in. So I'm just going to get a scoop full of soil all the way around the edges. Don't fill the pot completely the first time, just do a small amount at a time. Get your chopstick or your proper bonsai repotting tool or whatever you're using for this, and we're going to push the soil into the spaces in the root ball. So what we're not doing is jamming it in, we're just trying to work the soil into the gaps in between the roots. Okay, so you're not compressing it, you're just making sure that it gets into all the gaps, and you'll be surprised at how much of the soil disappears. And try and get it right underneath, so at an angle like this. You can also use a circular motion if you've got a bit of a gap. That tends to, it's almost like a little vortex, it actually pushes the soil down into the gaps. So now I've done a bit round that side, a little bit more around here. Again, don't fill it the first time, just put a layer of soil in and then make sure that's worked well into the root ball. And you can see, again, you can see that I almost filled the pot to the brim with that lot, and it's now a good centimetre below the surface, and this is just because there are lots of voids now in between the roots where you've taken all the old soil off, and we're now filling those up. So it takes more soil than you think. And again, obviously depending on the size of the pot, I mean if you've got a much deeper pot than this, you might find that there's even more voids because you've obviously made space. Yeah, we've got a big old gap at the front here, and it's actually, even though we had the mound underneath, when it's spread out, it hasn't quite spread out right to the edge of the root ball underneath. So what's happening to a lot of this soil is it's actually going slightly underneath the root ball, and obviously that disappearing. So again, we're not trying to compress the soil, we're just trying to fill all the gaps, because you want to leave some gaps. You want to leave some space in the soil for air and water to permeate. And if it's totally compressed, then you'll probably find when you water that the water just rolls off the top of the soil, and that's not a good sign. It should drain all the way through the soil. Once again, now I'm starting to pile the soil up, because I know that as I do this process, that soil's going to drop in level. Yeah. And just make sure you find all the gaps, make sure all the roots are underneath the surface. But you also don't want to press too hard, because you don't want to damage the roots, because you've already put the tree under a certain amount of stress by root pruning and moving it to a new pot. So yeah. I'm just going to uncover that root buttress at the top there, because I can't like that. Nearly there, I think. Front there. Now we have the tree in its new home. You'll notice there's a couple of little fine roots coming out the top there. I'm going to leave those, because they'll either root into the soil or they'll dry up and die off on their own. But gives it a bit of time to develop some new ones. So there we are. That's the tree completely repotted and should be well happy in its new home. The only thing to do now is give it a really good soaking. Okay, so that's the tree repotted in its new home. So I'm just going to summarise a few of the things. Try and do your repot in early spring if you can. If you can't, then just be very careful with the watering. Don't overlog it, don't keep it near a heat source, and don't put it in direct sunlight for too long. All of those things potentially can dry out your roots, and you don't want that, especially if you're not doing it at the optimum time of year. So leave it to spring if you can. Try not to take off more than a third of the root ball. That's critical. You know, if it's a very healthy tree, you might get away with a bit more, but as a rule of thumb, stick to the third, and all will be well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you'll have got something from it and learned how to repot your indoor bonsai. If you've got any comments, please leave them below. It'd be great if you could subscribe, please do. And obviously, if you want to have a look on the website, we've got all the equipment for sale, but we also do online lessons, so I can talk you through this process on your own individual tree. And we do lessons here at the nursery for those of you who are anywhere near Mid Wales, which seems to be not very many people. But we would be happy to welcome you to the nursery. So again, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found it useful. Thanks again from Sekatsu Bonsai School.